To lead our second panel, I'm really happy to introduce David Sullivan. David is not only a member of the Silicon Flatirons Advisory Board, but he is the founding executive director of the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership. Prior to that, David served as the program director for the Global Network Initiative, GNI, where I worked with him both in my current and previous roles. Thank you for joining us, David. You've got the mic.
Thank you, Amy. Thanks, everybody. Delighted to be here and really looking forward to building on the insights from our first panel as we start getting into really the specifics of what process means. We have time is in short supply relative to the brain power on this panel. So I'm just going to briefly introduce everybody before kicking things off. So I should just note first that my pronouns are he, him. Together we have on this panel Erin Kenneally, who is Director of Cyber Risk Strategy at Guidewire, Cyber Risk Analytics. We have, her pronouns are she, her. Leah Kistner, who is the Head of Privacy Engineering at Twitter and whose pronouns are they, them. And Deji Bryce Olukotun, who is Director of Policy and Corporate Social Responsibility at Sonos and whose pronouns are he, him. So getting right into things, I wanted to sort of go straight to the heart of the matter and start with Leah. Leah, you've spent more than a decade working in some of the largest technology companies on the planet, building things like privacy and security into the development of products, into engineering. I'm curious, what does that look like in practice? And sort of what are the top things that you would advise a company who's thinking about how do we build ethics into our product development process? What would you advise them to do? What would you advise them not to do?
So, hi all. I'm the head of privacy engineering at Twitter, but I used to be the global lead of privacy technology at Google. I designed and built a lot of Google security infrastructure back in the day. I also went in last summer and helped Zoom deal with their exciting problems. And I was the chief privacy officer of a startup named Humu. So I've had a little bit of a range of experiences on this and put a lot of security and privacy processes in place. So it's going to start off a little weird. Process is not enough, right? Policy isn't enough. And what I tend to see is people will, when they're starting up these things, they'll say, I'm going to go and make a process, I'm going to make a policy, and this is going to solve my problem. Here's the thing. These things almost always will diverge from the real state of the world. And privacy and security is about what's actually happening in your system and what's actually happening in your product. And you need to focus on that part of it. Policy and process are tools you can use to get there. But if you look at those first, you will tend to build a lot of process and a lot of policy as opposed to usually the things that you actually need. So things you should do in very, very, very brief, because I can talk for hours about this stuff. You want to help people understand that great products and great systems are respectful, right? We, from privacy, security, trust and safety, I think of myself as working in the terrible things that happen on the internet business. We're here to help those people who are building products and systems build great products and systems. I also use a Here There Be Dragons model, right? If you're like on old maps where there's like places with lots of little towns and maps mapped out really well. And then there's the part where they don't know what's going on and they put dragons out there and they are beautiful dragons. But the same thing happens when you're doing development, where there's a bunch of things that people really should be able to do. The systems they're touching are really robust. The practices are really robust. They're unlikely to shoot themselves in the foot over there. They may need a check, but it's going to be fine. What you want is to have somebody help them. And they're like, I need to touch location data. Great. We are there to help you. We are going to hold your hand and walk right by the dragon. And how those things change over time, like they can both expand and contract, and that's important to take into account as well. But long story, be there to help them when needed, right? One of the things you can do is get people to work on security and privacy part-time. I very strongly recommend you get the engineers. Do not get the product managers. Do not get the program managers. They're wonderful human beings. I loved working with them, but their incentives are very strongly aligned towards getting things to launch. So you want to get the people who are, they're supposed to get things launched right, and get them to spend part of their time on your team, because partially that gives you an amazing view into exactly what's happening in all the teams, but also they just start designing better. And if something goes wrong, you have somebody to call up who knows how that system works in really great depth. Do assurance. Don't assume that your system does what you think it does. It doesn't. I've debugged production too many times. Just trust me, it doesn't do what you think it does. Build in the way that makes compliance a side effect of the system's working correctly. People in most places do not find compliance motivating at all. Like, they just don't, and that will tend to make them very grumpy about dealing with you. If you talk to them about like, we need to keep this promise we made to our users, they'll talk to you about it all day. So like great, we're going to make that compliance stuff happen, but that's not what we're going to talk about. You need to build technology to give you better choices, because the choices that you have in the system right now are probably not the best ones that you can have. And you're going to really need to think about where can you very carefully add things, change things. There are also a bunch of things you should not do. Don't make the privacy and security team the people who show up and say no. Very rarely should you need to say no in a reasonably operating company. Usually you need to say things like, that's really interesting. Can you back up 3 steps and tell me why you want to do that thing? Because it's probably something reasonable. It's probably something reasonable. And you're like, I'm going to go help you get to the thing you actually wanted, but even if the thing that you told me you wanted to launch is absolutely terrifying. Don't come in late in the development process. If you have the number of times where I had somebody come in really late and say, I want to launch this thing. And I'm like, oh, you made a bad choice 6 months ago. And you have to go back, and they've had to go back and redo 6 months of work. Now, while that had a salutary effect on everybody in their general vicinity, where no one came to talk to me late anymore, it's not good. Don't design your process so you come in late. You really want to have a contact at design time. Don't ever ask people they don't know questions they don't know the answers to. If you are asking an engineer whether something is PII, or heaven forfend, what the category of processing is, you are in trouble. They do not know how to answer that question. Given the level of nuance about things like IP addresses, let alone anything more complicated, you are probably in bad trouble. Don't ask them any question that they don't know the answer to. Don't rely on a lot of manual work. People are very, very bad at doing complicated things repeatedly. So you want to try and pull out things that are going to be repeated and try not to make them repeated anymore. Don't rely on what people say at launch time rather than ongoing assurance through techniques like system monitoring, code analysis, and penetration testing. Systems diverge really rapidly from and systems often don't match what you think they did. Even if the team thinks that it does that, the number of times that we've gone in and been like, it turns out your system does a bad thing. I'm really glad I looked at the code. And last one, please, 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 as someone with a PhD in crypto who's done a lot of anonymization, do not roll your own anonymization and do not roll your own crypto without somebody who is very deeply qualified for this. Those two are the places that I see people screw up virtually every time they touch them, because it is subtle, it is quick to anger, and you are not going to know you messed it up until way, way too late. Like, these are specialist fields. Approach with care.
Thank you, Leah. That was terrific. I think some really hard-won lessons and insights. So now I want to broaden things out a little bit and also start to build on, I think, some of the great observations and insights from our first panel about the importance of bringing actors beyond companies into these discussions, including researchers and research and development, whether that's happening inside companies, inside universities, via the government. So I want to turn now to Erin. Erin, who previously was at DHS, where you led a process to identify and elaborate ethical principles and approaches to ICT research. So I was wondering how those principles can inform practice, whether it's across industry, government, academia, when it comes to processes to develop ICT research and to use that research.
Sure, thanks, David. And that guidance that you just referred to is called the Menlo Report, which is ethical principles guiding information communication technology research. It was modeled off of the Belmont Report, which for those of you who may be aware or may not be aware, I should say, was then codified into the Common Rule. And the Common Rule is what establishes our IRB structure here in the US, and that's for any institution that gets federal funding for R&D. So before I directly answer your question, I think I'd like to take a little quick preamble, which is important and relevant for this discussion. I think it's worth taking a quick stroll down kind of motivation lane, as I think even industrial development of technology shares some of the same drivers as what drove us to produce the Menlo Report. We have a historical basis for ethical protections for human subjects, and this was early on driven by things like biomedical research abuses. We had forced medical experiments on Nazi-held prisoners in World War II. Now, specific to Menlo, what we saw the train coming down the tracks with regards to kind of potentially ill-advised regulation or things going sideways and getting New York Times in the context of really well-served technology research and development. So we were, the folks in our group and the researchers that we built this around were studying the structure of underground criminal economy, things like, understanding software radio attacks on pacemakers and ICDs, taking over botnets and redirecting spam, things like that. So knowing that this work was, for the betterment of science, we really wanted to make sure we didn't run afoul of the law and social expectations. I think while tech has yet to sort of cause anything on the order of harm severity that we saw with the biomedical abuses, we've definitely seen from a frequency standpoint increasing ethically challenged uses of technology. And I'm sure the earlier panel, which unfortunately I was unable to attend, spoke to some of those, and we're all kind of familiar with them, right? Deep fakes, technology addictions, racially biased image systems, surveillance by household goods, that kind of a thing, Cambridge Analytica. I would also point out, in addition to kind of these historical basis for this need for principles and practices, we've got, really a difference with distinction, I would say, with regards to sensing and judgment of harm with regards to technology, relative to our institutionalized and kind of socially internalized understanding of what harm is related to physical interactions with people. Our ability to kind of qualitatively and quantitatively assess and balance harms and benefits with technology are immature, right? We've got scale and speed and tight coupling of systems and decentralization and really opaque risk factors that make for conditions that enable harm to occur without us necessarily knowing about it or knowing about it too late. So to the specific question, of how these principles inform practice, I'll use my go-to analogy. It stood the test of time for me, and it's this. I think of ethics as a three-legged stool. You've got principles as one leg, the application of those principles the second, and then enforcement of those principles and applications third. And then I think kind of the seat on top of them is incentives, right? If there's no incentives, then those legs really aren't, holding anything up, or vice versa. With regards to principles, I'm not going to spend time here. We're all pretty familiar with them. I think the previous panel discussed them. But I will say that, I think we've pretty much exhausted the denominator with regards to kind of the world of possible principles that we should take into account. And we're moving towards some convergence on kind of the numerator. I can pretty easily crosswalk any set of principles to what we laid out in Menlo, which was respect for persons, beneficence, justice, and then respect for law. I think most advancement on the tech ethics front has been on this first leg of the stool, the principles. We've got professional org codes. We've got, I know in AI, something like over 65 codes, documents, and things like that. So moving on to, I think, the more important point for this panel is the applications. To me, tech ethics is really about assessing and anticipating the risk of harm from a technology, be that a product or a service or a feature, and then reducing the uncertainty of those uses and impacts of the technology. We've seen less advancement on the application of ethical tech principles here, but we've seen some progress, right? And I'm talking about tools, right? Tools to provide kind of decision support. A lot of questionnaire-based approaches have emerged. We've got things like ethical impact assessments. And I think we've made progress. I still believe, though, that there's a shortage of ethics risk management guidance for companies. I will note that with regards to the Menlo report, we had a companion report, which was this questionnaire-based approach. That was later operationalized into an ethical impact assessment that then was further operationalized into this thing that we called the CREDS tool. And really what it was a questionnaire wizard kind of based tool that was driven by kind of conditional logic, underpinned by these questions. And it was really anchored around the R&D life cycle, which is very similar to technology life cycle. So I don't think there's really any need to kind of differentiate, and which is to say the collection, use, disclosure of data and systems. So just to be a little bit more concrete, so this notion, this principle of respect for persons, well, it can be applied in any number of ways. We pointed out identification of stakeholders is one way that you can apply this notion of respect for persons. Informed consent is another one. This notion of beneficence, which is balancing risks or harms and benefits, I should say, really can break down from an application perspective to, okay, identify your harms, identify potential benefits, and then go through this balancing exercise where you're weighing kind of the burdens of tech and risk of harm to your stakeholders who were identified previously against the benefits that would, accrue to larger society as a result of the technology. And I would also note that kind of the application of this principle is probably the most complicated. The key is having, to this application question is having really a framework for applying the principles vis-a-vis whatever your tool of choice may be. It helps oversight entities that may not be familiar with IT kind of understand and reason about the ethical issues and the process by which your organization has gone through assessing the risk. It provides documented kind of transparent benchmark upon which stakeholders can then, kind of determine how trustworthy, I should say, is your organization. It counters visibility bias. That's another thing. One of the major impediments to kind of accurate risk forecasting, and I do this in the context of cyber risk, is visibility bias. So not seeing all the factors that inform the totality of the risk. I think having a framework helps in that regard. And it also, obviously provides a self-help mechanism for technology companies. I guess maybe the last thing I'll comment on is, again, whatever tool or mechanism that you choose to embrace to kind of apply these principles, one helpful mechanism may be to engage kind of a threat model approach, where you think of the threat as a failure to kind of embed these principles in your design choices, and then develop prevention and mitigation strategies and techniques for those threats that you identify, right? So ask how, for instance, how could bad actors use the technology to harm the rights or interests of individuals or of groups or of society, or in fact, maybe even undermine trust in social institutions. And then I think it's also important to assess not only the first order consequences of your technology or your service or your platform, whatever the technology is, but also it bears looking at the second and third order impacts, right? That kind of that collateral damage that might sneak into the equation. Prioritization is important here. You don't necessarily have to go through this rigorous assessment for every technology that really doesn't have consequence to users. And then I just think part of that framework needs to include a governance structure. We've also heard this notion of transparency and explainability. Those are topics in and of themselves, and we can perhaps delve into them later, but I would just point those out as well.
Thanks, Erin. So much to chew on there. I really want to circle back to a few of those comments down the road, and I couldn't agree with you more that in this space there is no shortage of principles, and it's how you actually apply those principles that really is the difference maker. Now, what we've heard so far, I think, is really focused a lot on the sort of internal processes that companies or other actors undertake when considering how they're developing and deploying new technologies. But I want to turn to Deji now to sort of look beyond, the sort of the institution that is making these decisions. When the rubber hits the road is really like, what are the impacts that these technologies have on people? What are those consequences that and risks that Erin just alluded to? So Deji, when it comes to listening to and learning from the kind of communities affected by your products, how does Sonos approach these difficult questions?
Thanks, David. It's really great to be here. The last in-person conference I went to was Silicon Flatirons before the pandemic started. So I hope to see you all in person again soon. And it's great to see you. So for folks who don't know who Sonos, what we are, what we do, we're a sound experience company. We were founded in 2002 above a Mexican restaurant in Santa Barbara, California, before the iPhone was released, and we invented the wireless audio market. So we have a strong history of innovation. To get an overview of all the things we're doing, which I won't have time to get into any detail, you can go to listenbetter.com, and that's kind of takes you to our environmental, social, and governance report, where we talk about things like sustainability, human rights in our supply chain, privacy. We released our first transparency report last year, and just also how we give back. So one of the things we do in terms of listening from and learning from different communities, it's partly my role, is to engage in conversations like these and learn and make myself available to all the different product groups across the company to serve as an ethical voice. But one thing that I've really enjoyed is our stakeholder roundtables. So this actually came out of our philanthropy program when we were trying to decide where we should invest our money to give back to communities. And what we do is we gather civil society groups, academics, sometimes even other companies. And we used to do it in person, which was really the best experience because we could showcase what we were about as well. And then we ask them what they're working on, what they think we should be thinking about, and then we share the different products we may have in development and try to get their feedback. That's something that we found works a lot better earlier in the process for a lot of the reasons that Leah and Erin have mentioned. And then we also have other communities that we work with when developing products. We have a strong beta testing pool. These are people who get an early access to our products. And they voluntarily join this program so they can see what's coming down the pipeline. In terms of our philanthropy, as I mentioned, we mostly focused on the area of music education, but with the pandemic, we shifted our philanthropy because there was a global need to do more in terms of giving back as a company. We also have our employee resource groups. So these are groups often from marginalized groups like Black at Sonos, Ability at Sonos, Women at Sonos, who are constantly kind of advising and engaging on our products and making themselves available. Just to make this a little bit more, give a more specific example, in the area of accessibility, we have an inclusive design group, and this is a cross-functional team from different areas of the company. And that includes members from our employee research group, Ability at, and they help us think about how our products are impacting people with impairments or disabilities. And we complement this with our beta pool. So I mentioned our beta testers and who get an early access, early look at our products. We invite people to self-identify if they, and we had a group of folks who identify as having accessibility challenges or identifying as disabled. And we work with them on different products that we're considering. You know, and then we try to complement that with our philanthropy again. So this is, we gave a grant to a really great nonprofit called Drake Music in the UK, and they specialize in hardware. It's a disabled-led organization, as they call themselves, and they make musical instruments for people with impairments. So they will actually design a specialized violin or clarinet or saxophone to people who have different types of impairments. And we gave them a grant for something called Planet Symphony, which is basically an immersive outdoor experience where you go to a garden in the UK, and you get to hear live music, and it's accessible and has very rich kind of you know, plants scents, and really awesome experience. So just to give you an example of how we're sort of bringing inputs from all aspects of our company, and I definitely want to dig into the more formal processes, but I know some of those questions are coming, so I won't go too long on that. Just one last thing, and maybe this touches on what Leah was saying a little bit earlier. We try to, in terms of the teams that are considering these new products, we try to meet them where they're at. So for example, at Sonos, we have what are called product requirement documents. And this is kind of a checklist. So whatever kind of product, these are things that must be in the product or must be considered. And make sure that we're speaking the language of the people who are building the products. So one thing is to get things like privacy or sustainability embedded in these product requirement documents. It's such a technical thing. It's very specialized. No one's going to tell you, you know, what that is called if you go to a new company. But that's been a very effective way to communicate with large groups of people who are making important decisions. So I'll stop there because I know we've got some good questions going. Happy to follow up on anything I mentioned.
Thanks, Deji. So yeah, so many things that have been raised. I think one thing that I wanted to maybe get into, one of the themes coming out of the first panel, I think, was the challenges around subjectivity when it comes to ethics in consideration of tech, and that terms like fairness, you know, how do you actually measure that? What does that mean? And so I'm just curious whether each of you could speak to sort of ways to make the process around the ethical development and deployment of technology less subjective and more objective. So I'm going to go back to Leah to kick us off with this one, and perhaps others can weigh in as well.
So honestly, the first thing that we do is try and take the weight of decisions off of people as much as possible, because there's only so much brain space that people have for this stuff. And if we take the piddly things off of their plates, they're much better at being able to think through this stuff. One other tool we use is human-centric threat modeling. So we said, hey, we need you to go, like, we need you, when you're thinking about your product, you want to think about the people who are affected by your product, both directly and indirectly. So directly is easy. That's the people who are actually, like, I don't know, uploading photos to your service. The people who are indirectly affected might be the people whose photos are being uploaded, right? This is a little bit more interesting when it comes to things like enterprise products, like credit bureaus, right? I am not their user, but I am affected by their system because, for example, they leaked a whole bunch of my data when they got hacked. So find those people, and then look at the different factors which can affect people's vulnerability to different kinds of attacks. And different people want different things, and they have different threats, and that's great. And if you're not actually solving for that, you're not actually solving the problem. So we had a whole big old list and said, here's a starter list, right? People who have visible marginalization, like, for example, Black people, right? Indigenous people are visibly marginalized. People who are not visible, who are marginalized, but in a way that may be less visible, like, so for example, trans people, queer people in general, disabled people / people with disabilities. It depends a little bit on which community, which language people tend to prefer. And you say, and here's a whole bunch of things. But we tried to do this in a way that was like, a let's think through this, right? Like every time we talk to you about your thing, we're like, okay, let's think through this with you. And after we do that a bit, it's not just about getting that product into a good state. It's about getting people to be able to think through this in the future. Anyways, we go through those, and then you look at your attackers, right? You look at attackers by what they want. So you say, okay, what do they want? Do they want money? Do they want to hurt somebody? Do they want to change the world? Like there's a whole bunch of things that attackers tend to want. Some attackers come with special bonus features, like they are insider attackers. They have privileged access to the inside of your system. They are particularly powerful in a bunch of different ways. And then you look at your system and you say, where does my system gonna break, right? What happens if this part breaks? What happens if this part breaks? What happens if they both break at the same time? And you can kind of go through that, and that tends to end up in places where different people will come out with a little bit more of the same answer, and people will not forget things nearly as much. We also had an active research program so at Google, I had a whole UX research team, and we would very actively feed this, because while the team was for tech extremely diverse, this is a low bar, right? We had people born on every continent except for Antarctica. 10 or 20% at least of the team was Black and Latinx. Very strong LGBT plus representation, range of disability statuses, people who came from all kinds of professional backgrounds, blah, 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 blah. Right? Like it's not my job to represent trans people at work. It's not, right? But it made us better at that. We also had an active research program. So for example, you can see papers that we put out about security and privacy practices of people who are survivors of intimate partner abuse. And so we could use that and feed that into this and make sure that we were keeping this up to date as much as possible.
I'll jump in real
Excellent.
quick on that. Yeah, I think those are great comments. I don't have a whole heck of a lot to add other than say, than to refer back to some of the suggestions I had made. I think this notion of identification of stakeholders and being transparent about it will really expose kind of the level of subjectivity or objectivity that the organization is at. I mean, look, frankly, I'll say this, and this works, or this applies, I should say, in the realm of kind of legal compliance. Half the battle is being able to outwardly demonstrate that you've made deliberate and thoughtful choices ex ante, right, before something bad happens. It's not to say it's going to prevent it necessarily, but when it comes to, the court of public opinion or regulators, if that's relevant, they're going to look at that. That's going to be a big factor. So, I think to the extent that, you can be involve a wide range of stakeholders in the design and the development and document that information, it really will go a long way. And that subjectivity, I think, will get snuffed out pretty quickly.
Yeah, I think I'll just chime in, adding one thing that we try to do a lot, which is helpful for us, and actually is pretty natural for most businesses, is to look at what is the what is the competitive landscape, but rather than think of it as competition, to think of it as sort of benchmarking with peers. So who is doing this right? Who do we respect? And who can we emulate? And I think one thing that gets lost is, and this, I don't want to steal the fire for your next question, David, but there are some companies with vastly different resources. So trying to, so some have a ton of resources at their disposal and have teams of 100 people working on privacy compliance. Others have one person or half a person. And just trying to benchmark and identify which peers are doing it right, which peers are doing it well, and what approaches have they taken that can translate over to the way we do things at our company, as opposed to this is the A+ student, doing higher math and you're just learning geometry. So I think that's one thing that we try, and the reason for that is people internally at the business are motivated, you can take away motivation when you're looking to something that's just completely disproportionate, or someone who's just way better. But if you say, look, this is what our friend or partner or business partner is doing, and then we can do it too. And actually we'll actively try to get peers at our company talking with peers at another company, and just trying to share best practices and what's to build a community. Because a lot of times people like myself, we don't have a lot of folks doing a similar role internally. So we have to go out and reach out and find out how other people are managing. And sometimes it's super creative solutions. Sometimes they're very basic, but it definitely helps.
I will say, as someone who is currently in the business of starting a coalition of technology companies working together to try to identify best practices for trust and safety, and to turn that into a framework that can be independently assessed, I'm taking detailed notes on everything that everyone has just said. And I think the point about trying to have systems that can apply, whether you have the teams of people dedicated to these different types of issues that a company like Google has, that Leah was alluding to, or to the company where one person is splitting this responsibility with like 6 other things. And so I was curious, Leah, since you went from Google to a startup, if I'm not mistaken, and so what was that like? And what, is there a way you can make these kinds of approaches sort of proportionate to the level of resources at play?
Yeah, I went from running a pretty dang large team at Google to the team was me and some other people in their copious free time. So the job splitting thing actually continued to work in a startup pretty well, right? So there's a guy named Jose, and he had never done privacy or security engineering before, but I co-opted him a little bit. I had him help debug a bunch of stuff, and then he was like, well, this is really interesting. And I was like, yes, I will talk to you about this all day long. So co-opting people 100% works. I do it shamelessly. One of the things that I do now is, and this is, apologies, is a shameless plug, but there is now a privacy engineering and respect conference. So if you sending people there, like, because just a couple of years ago, all of the privacy engineers, basically, virtually all of them were, actually almost all of them were in the world reported to me, which is not a good situation. But we started seeing more people come into the field, and it was like, oh, good, now we can have an actual conference. So the talks are up online for that, and that tends to be a good place to pick up, who's doing what kind of research, what are we seeing in academia, what are we seeing coming out of companies. Also, and this is not intended to be a shameless plug, I catch a lot of stuff on Twitter. So there's a bunch of the research teams at some of these companies will try to put things out externally. And so you can pick them up, especially like a differential privacy community. Doesn't matter if it's if they're in a company or not. They'll try and put out papers, so you can try and keep up on those. So those are a bunch of my like really major sources for leaning on the teams that other people have.
That's great. Well, we can definitely, I see Amy is already ahead of me so that's on something else in terms of making sure people's questions go into the Q&A and not into the chat. But let's also drop some of those resources, Leah, that you just mentioned into the chat as well. I know that the Silicon Flatirons folks are collecting some of those. I want to make sure we do get to questions, including a student question. But before that, there were just a couple other things that I wanted to pick up on that also are picking up on, I think, some of the observations that have been made in the chat. One thing, so we heard about the impact assessment approach that BSA has put out for artificial intelligence during the first panel. And we heard Erin mention impact assessments as a key aspect of the Menlo framework that she described. There are now, I've been trying to keep track of the number of different types of impact assessments that folks in the tech space can and should be doing, from privacy impact assessments, ethical impact assessments, data protection impact assessments, human rights impact assessments, algorithmic impact assessments. Erin, how do we keep all of these different approaches from conflicting with one another? Is there some way that companies, and again, maybe thinking to the startup side of things as opposed to the behemoth that can put a team on each one of these things, how can we sort of keep all of these different approaches from conflicting with one another? And perhaps also, how do we think about that internationally as governments, legislators, and regulators are thinking about different requirements for companies across all of these different issues?
Sure. First off, I have a strong opinion that if laws are constructed correctly, they're going to embed our ethics, right? And that we all know that doesn't happen oftentimes, but it does occur oftentimes as well. And you can say the same about some of our policies and standards as well. So in that regard, I come from the place where I do believe that there's much commonality between all these, different impact assessments and whatnot. And in the context of, okay, how do we kind of include this within this realm of all these other risks that, we have corporate legal departments stood up for and whatnot. First off, I don't think there's a need to stand up a separate ethics structure. I actually think that ethics should be embedded in the existing risk governance mechanisms. Perhaps, taking existing risk management, frameworks and questions, reassessing them to include a lot of these ethical considerations, I think is the right approach. I think another approach is to engage, knowledgeable domain experts to kind of crosswalk these existing governance and risk management practices and policies, and then, and have them help you embed those ethics there too. We don't hesitate to hire attorneys if we're worried about legal risk. Why should we hesitate to bring on, domain experts in this regard as well? On the international front, first off, I'm a big believer that, you've got to start kind of local and control what you can control. I do think that there's an opportunity to kind of share lessons learned and benchmark ethics in those type of global international settings. I mean, that's how we share knowledge and what works and what doesn't work. And I know there's been a number of efforts. I think the OECD one is the first one that comes to mind. Those are important, absolutely. But at the end of the day, I think the more important part is, having these conversations globally, identifying, areas that we have in common with regards to principles and applications, respecting that, look, not everyone is going to apply or necessarily enforce a principle that is, that you share in the same way. And that's okay. Right. The bar from an ethics standpoint with regards to technologies, frankly, is pretty low now. So, the starting point should be like, let's do something. Like, perfection can be the enemy of the good here. So let's do something. And I think there's, as I mentioned before, right, there's something like 65 plus, international, global, organizational type principles documents just in the AI space, and looking at those again, there's a ton of commonality across those. They don't all say the same thing, But, you know, again, I've been in this space for a while, so I can look at something and say, wow, this is very similar to this principle or this application. So, you know, we're not talking apples and oranges. I think that's a sign of promise in that regard.
David,
Always
if I
good.
can comment, yeah,
Yeah,
on that,
please.
just chime in. You know, from someone who has to operationalize this stuff, it's interesting because, you know, we do some of this work because it's the right thing to do, and we have a clear mandate to do that. But at a certain point, you do need signals from stakeholders. So you do need to know, would an algorithmic impact assessment, is that valued? And I include investors in that. You know, we do look to how investor ratings agencies and investors are looking at some of these efforts. And, you know, you can see a lot of thought going towards climate, for example. So it's natural that a lot of companies are steering in that direction. And I think that's an important one. And you know, if you do take the time and motivate everyone internally to do this assessment because it's the right thing to do, but then what are the consequences? What's the follow through? If you, I think people are always going to be asked the question, well, if I didn't do it, what would I, and this relates to Erin's point about enforcement, you know, what would be the negative side of that? And, you know, I think if you think of that three-legged stool that Erin mentioned earlier, you know, making sure that these assessments have an incentive built in, so that if you're filling out a human rights impact assessment as someone who's building a product, you can see the value to the end product beyond the right thing to do, because there are a lot, and we do have to make those choices. I wouldn't necessarily call them trade-offs, because I always feel like that's a negative framing, but I think we want to know, where should we be emphasizing? And then, do you have our back? If we take the time to do a human rights impact assessment or another assessment, and someone comes after us for whatever reason, you know, and says we did something wrong, will you say that, no, look, this company did this assessment and it shows they're committed, and we need to value that? You know, sometimes, and by have our back, I sort of mean in the sense that there are times where companies have to extend themselves and take risks on certain things. And to get support from civil society when things don't necessarily go right can really make a difference, or academia or another stakeholder. So those are just some of the things that we think about. And I definitely think they're super important and we need to learn from them, but we do have to make choices sometimes about which ones to use.
You know, the other thing, just real quick, I just wanted to tag on something that you said. You know, we're quick to jump on sort of the parade of horribles, and the media loves to, you know, sink their teeth into the, you know, the latest and greatest, you know, ethical wrong. We don't do a good job of championing the folks who do it right, and making, you know, kind of heroes out of them. And I think that would go a long way as well.
One of the things that I like, Deji is 100% right. We cannot do all of these things. It is literally impossible, and some things kind of contradict each other. Thanks, people passing privacy laws. Please make sure they work together. I got one system, and the more weird dongles I have to put on it, the more likely it is to have bugs. But the goal that I have when I'm building the process for this stuff is I want compliance, and I want all of the stuff to be a side effect of the system working correctly, right? And because for a couple of reasons. One of them is compliance is necessarily reactive, and like it just is. That's how it is. It's like somebody made a checklist. It's a reactive checklist. I mean, I care about not making those mistakes, but I care just as much about not making new mistakes, because and this might be swayed a little bit by the kinds of companies that I've worked at, but you can make new and exciting mistakes that aren't illegal at the time you make them, and you will still get in trouble, right? So if I find people having to think about particular frameworks or anything like that when they're doing the development, then I think we probably have a problem. Like, I need to be asking them questions they know the answers to. I need to be asking them with the right information in the right place at the right time to do that. And I need to be able to have it be very clearly part of the development process.
So, all right, an incredible amount to chew on there. I think really helpful in terms of thinking about how we can sort of, aim to not just kind of, not make the same mistakes again, but perhaps not always make new mistakes. With that, I think it's now time to turn to audience questions. And as noted, at Silicon Flatirons, we have the Phil Weiser rule, where a student asks the first question. So I think we have Jonathan Stokely ready for that first question. Jonathan, are you with us?
I am. Hello. Thank you for your time today. It was a very intellectually stimulating conversation. As somebody who's worked in technology for the last 10 years before coming back to school to get my master's of business administration, actually in the second year, ethics has always been at the forefront of implementing technology and improving the technology platforms I've worked on. And there's definitely been a few different times where you're kind of implementing something, like wondering how this is going to work, especially in terms of like capturing data and customer data, and especially within the bounds of the law. So I'm curious of two different aspects of the question. I've worked a lot in fintech with algorithmic trading, and then on the other side of at what point is the markets reacting to the technology that we're stimulating and putting into it? I mean, whether it's Twitter and sentiment analysis, and then everything else you see in the news. And then at what point, kind of the second part of that question is, if you see something, do you say something, or, when's the right time to pull the plug? So really it's kind of an open-ended question, but there's just the two thoughts of, my past with the algorithmic trading and all the volatility we see in the markets, and how technology has essentially changed how trading actually works. But then at the same time, as you're implementing things to kind of help reach that next second higher level, how do you pull the plug on that?
Could you help me understand a little bit more about what you mean by pull the plug?
Well, I mean, if you get to a certain point where you maybe crossing a threshold, or you start implementing something, and then you've working with engineers, and you have the kind of the project layout, and then you start to see applications of the technology that you're implementing, and especially when in terms of marketing and data gathering, of every button click, screen time, how much I've read, how long I scrolled, and all that data is gathered and then fed into another system that's analyzed either by additional algorithms, or it's fed into a salesperson so they can pick up the phone and say, hey, Mr. Customer, I see you're interested in XYZ product. And I work specifically this on the financial side of things, and I know it's even more rampant in data privacy laws on the non-financial side of things. So it's just curious if you could kind of talk to at what point of like, hey, I'm implementing the system and it's gathering all these data and touch points, and on the front side, it's doing nothing more than serving up an advertisement that maybe is a little bit more directed at things I might be interested in purchasing. But on the other side of the coin, some of this data can be potentially used for nefarious aspects. And so at what point should you maybe take a step back and say, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing this? But at the end, it's all about shareholder profits, and ergo kind of my other aspect of the algorithmic trading side of things. It's, when is enough, and we should just kind of, not be implementing some of this technology. And how do I approach that conversation with the manager or shareholders and saying, hey, this isn't exactly what we thought it might be all cracked up to be?
So I think that you should be doing that over and over again, right? You should that's something you should be asking every single time you're picking up data, and you should also try to align incentives so that people are picking up the right data and keeping it for the right reasons. Help people understand that it is expensive to manage data, right? You don't want data that you don't actually really need. It is expensive. You need to all of the care and feeding around that is expensive.
And I
One
think
of
that's
the
one of the
techniques
issues
that
right
tends to
now
be
is oh, sorry, because I mean, companies are massively just scraping data right now, and they're just sitting there and they're just waiting for technology to catch up and figure out what to do with it.
I think there may be slightly less of that than you would think, because but some of that is things like, do you have a logging framework that knows how to not log everything? Right? You actually have to build that, because it's much easier to log everything. It's than to not log everything, right? Do you know how, like, how many, like, oh crap, we logged everybody's password things there are? It's not because people tried to log the password, it's because the logging framework, because it's much easier to log everything or nothing than things in between. One of the things that I found is very helpful when explaining why a particular thing might not be a good choice and why we should probably not do that thing. I try most of the time to be like, well, what is it that you actually want? Let's figure out how to get there. But sometimes this thing is not a good idea. One of the most important things is not to hand this poor exec here's a technical risk and here's a business thing. Right. What you've just handed them is apples and flaming orangutans, and they don't know how to deal with that. And they don't know how to make a decision. So you have to kind of try and translate into a framework that people are going to understand. Here's the New York Times headline that will come out of about this. And people go, well, that would be bad. Yeah, you don't want that. So let's do this other thing. Giving people concrete alternatives like that also helps a lot. Sometimes being able to say, here's what this, basically, here's what this means.
Could I chime in, Leah, here on this?
Go.
So yeah, one thing, thanks. And this is related to speaking out when you see something. What's often surprising is how many other people may share your opinion but have been quiet, maybe because they didn't know how to say it, or they've been saying it and didn't realize there's someone else in the company who has the same opinion. And so that moment of speaking out, which is very much what people in civil society and do all the time, companies are not a monolith at all. There could be groups which are super, pro-private on one side, and then there's just one group that has a revenue goal that they have to meet, and they're just trying to get there. And and I think that involves also civil society talking to companies publicly or calling them out on something, that it's not a monolith inside. There may be people inside who are championing a cause who haven't had their voice heard, and suddenly because an activist outside is saying something, then they're listened to. So I think that's another thing that just kind of having faith that there are lots of people with different kinds of opinions inside as well has been effective for my work.
I would just add, I think continuous monitoring, like think of in the context of kind of threat modeling, risk management, right? You don't do it once and forget about it. It's a continuous process. Same holds true for this situation, I think would address the scenario that you raised. And then to your first question, I would caution strongly against looking at, near-term market reactions as, a signal that practices are ethical or not. I know in my world, with regard to data breaches, there was quite a bit of study done on, how does the stock price of a company on the heels of a data breach, how is that impacted? And the reality is, I don't think you can tell much from short-term stock prices. I think you've got to look at sort of long-term trends from a financial standpoint, especially because incentives are so driven by short-term profits.
So I think we have time very briefly for one more question. So I think Dan has posed a question we're going to tackle. How does regulation ever keep up with the rapid change of technology? What tests can we humans have that any technology can be tested against? Dan, I hope I did your question justice, and open it up to our panelists to perhaps drop a closing thought in response to that.
I'll take that. A couple things. One is, look, there's always going to be a gap between our laws, which really inform our expectations, and our technology development, which really inform our capabilities. What can we do and what should we do? I don't know that we want a world where there is no gap, right? Because we tend to value innovation. This is a perfect segue to, I think, or champion for this entire panel, which is to say, I see ethics as that mechanism to sort of moderate that delta between capabilities and expectations, between what we can do and what the law formally says we should do, because it takes so long. The law is slow to change for good reason and sometimes for not. But I think the ethics fits perfectly as sort of a mechanism to mind that gap.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, there are things, so whenever you build something that requires compliance, what you're going to get is a checklist. Like by design, you're going to get a checklist. And there's this really useful thought sorting thing. There's a thing called the Kenneally, and it talks about, in part, about the difference between complicated and complex problems. Complicated ones are ones where you have to think really, really hard, and you're gonna use all your expertise, and you're gonna come out at the end with an answer, and that's really cool. And then there's complex problems, and we're like, I don't know. We're going to have to figure this out from first principles. Like, this is where research problems live. So things like, for example, algorithmic fairness live very squarely in a lot of ways in complex. A lot of privacy still lives very squarely in complex. Security has been kind of moving around. You have to get to well understood problems until you get a checklist that works really well. And so, and a lot of us have been working to like kind of move things around, kind of down that direction, but we don't know how to build good laws that are about things that are research problems, because like we don't know how to build a checklist that actually has a correspondence with the thing that we want to regulate. So it's one of those things where anything that's in research land is going to be very hard. And so that's cool. We should keep trying to push this towards places where we have repeatable understanding of repeatable processes and scalable systems, and then work it in that way.
I
Deji,
love that framework. Yeah, I've got one last thing, David. One last thing.
No,
so
please. I was
one
going to
sentence.
ask you
Yeah.
to put on your science fiction author hat for
okay.
a second when thinking about this one as well.
Oh, jeez. I write science fiction on the side. Wow, that's a hard one. Well, I mean, I think the trend is it's easier in science fiction, it's much easier to imagine what could go wrong rather than what can go right. So actually, science fiction is a very useful tool to think about, even in regulation. One of the first stories I wrote was what would happen if you could copyright. So there's a famous musical composition, and it's a series of musical rests. So what could happen if you copyrighted musical rests? You'd basically be copyrighting silence, and then you take that, so that's a regulation, and then you take that and someone gets paid every time there's silence in over the air. I mean, you could take things out, and that person becomes, the richest person on the planet. You can take things out, in that absurd way and just follow their logical conclusion. It is helpful for regulation and law. It tends to be a negative framing. The positive exercise is much more difficult and very enjoyable, and totally recommend that. I was just on a non-sci-fi, I was just going to say, when thinking about regulation, I often will sometimes say, substitute the word protection. So are we talking about protections, and who are we protecting? Because the word regulation is so loaded. At some moments we do need protections, and what are we protecting from, and who are we protecting, and why? And just to sort of switch those out from time to time and say, what am I really rallying? Am I rallying against the notion of regulation, or am I rallying against, or actually would something good be available here? So thanks. I mixed the answers there, David, but.
No, that was great. So I want to thank our panelists for this session. I learned a tremendous amount thanks to Silicon Flatirons, and really looking forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David. Thanks to all of our panelists. This
Thank
was
you.
really amazing.